Grenfell, a complete and utter disaster.
The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. We uncovered many more matters of concern to our examination of the refurbishment, the selection of materials, the way in which fire safety at Grenfell Tower was managed, as well as the relationship between the tenant management organisation and the residents of the tower. But a number of questions relating to organisation and training could not be answered at that stage and were deferred for consideration in Phase 2, including the relative contributions of the different materials used in the cladding.
I'm going to be covering what was said at the inquiry today and going into more depth, and so I had a bit of time to go over what was actually put into the documents talking about the inquiry into the Grenfell fire. It's shocking. However, tomorrow I hope to do something even more detailed, because this is systemic across the United Kingdom as a problem. There is too much corruption, it's shocking, and it's based on a culture of deregulation. And this true meaning of deregulation in this context was essentially sacrificing public safety for financial savings and convenience, leading to a culture of complacency and neglect that culminated in the Grenfell Tower disaster. And wait to the end to hear this Tory minister talk about the Grenfell inquiry and his interpretation of what actually took place, and the government under the Tories' response.
The report we're publishing today contains our findings on all these and other matters. However, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. They include the government, the tenant management organisation, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, those who manufactured and supplied the materials used in the refurbishment, those who certified their suitability for use on high-rise buildings, the architect, the principal contractor, and some of its subcontractors, in particularly Harley Curtain Wall and its successor Harley Facades, some of the consultants, in particular the fire engineer Exover Warrington Fire, the local authority's building control department, and the London Fire Brigade.
That list is massive, but there is one group that I think is missed out, and that is governments, both Tory and Labour, that have also neglected this issue because of their obsession with deregulation. We'll talk about that later.
Not all of them bear the same degree of responsibility for the eventual disaster, but as our reports show, all contributed to it in one way or another, in most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed.
I'm going to comment, but I'm also going to try and limit it so you get a full scope of what's said, but note the word corruption, dishonesty. You're going to be shocked at what you hear as this continues.
The failings can be traced back over many years, and our efforts to get to the bottom of what went wrong and why account for the length of our report and the time it has taken us to produce it. However, if an inquiry of this kind is to produce anything of value, it is necessary for those who can influence the future direction of the construction industry, the fire and rescue services, the management of fire safety in buildings, and resilience planning, to understand exactly where mistakes were made and how they can be avoided in the future. It begins by explaining how the regulations and guidance in force at the time of the refurbishment came into being, and the way in which the reaction to fire of materials used in the construction of modern high-rise buildings was tested. We then consider the involvement of the government in the form of the then Department for Communities and Local Government, the way in which it sought to monitor the causes of fires when they occurred, and most importantly, the warning signs that were emerging from as early as 1991 that some kinds of materials, in particular aluminium composite material panels with unmodified polyethylene cores, were dangerous. We find that there was a failure on the part of the government and others to give proper consideration at an early stage to the dangers of using combustible materials in the walls of high-rise buildings.
To repeat, they deliberately put flammable materials up onto these buildings, and some of them are still there, to save money. Because they don't give a about you, me, or anyone else. It's all about making money.
That including failing to amend in an appropriate way the statutory guidance on the construction of external walls. That is where the seeds of the disaster were sown. In part 3, we set out our findings about the testing and marketing of the main products used in the refurbishment: the Rainabond panels, the Celotex RS5000 insulation, and the small amount of Kingspan K15 insulation. We discovered that there had been systematic dishonesty on the part of manufacturers involving deliberate manipulation of the testing processes and calculated attempts to mislead purchasers into thinking that what were combustible materials complied with the provisions of the statutory guidance that advised against their use.
This is corporate manslaughter, what they've done. They didn't care about the fact that someone could die. What they were more interested in is profit. And as you know, I like to make film references. This is reminding me of the Ferengi from Star Trek. It's reminding me of the scene in Fight Club where they go and analyse whether or not to recall a vehicle based on how likely the danger is of that vehicle catching fire, but also the financial cost of whether or not it was worthwhile doing that instead of paying out insurance.
That dishonest approach to marketing was compounded by the failure of two of the bodies that provided certificates of compliance with the building regulations and statutory guidance: the British Board of Agreement and Local Authority Building Control, to scrutinise the information provided to them with sufficient care and exercise the degree of rigour and independence that was to be expected of them. The tenant management organisation was at the heart of events leading up to the fire. In part 4 of the report, we make our findings about its relationship with the residents of Grenfell Tower. We find that the organisation was badly run and failed to respond to criticisms of its treatment of residents contained in independent reports produced in 2009. It is clear that for some years before the fire, relations between the TMO and residents were marked by distrust, antagonism, and increasingly bitter confrontation. We find that for the TMO to have allowed the relationship to deteriorate to such an extent reflects a serious failure on its part to observe its basic responsibilities. Part 5 of the report is concerned with the management of fire safety at the tower. Again, we find that the residents were badly let down. The picture is one of a persistent failure to give sufficient importance to the demands of fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people, and a failure on the part of the Council to scrutinise that aspect of the organisation's activities adequately.
To me, if I was a betting man, it would be that someone on the council had been paid off and it wasn't worth their time. That would be my guess. I'm not saying it is, I'm just making the allegation.
Part of the reason for that was the failure of the Chief Executive, Robert Black, to ensure that the board of the TMO and the Council were kept properly informed of matters affecting fire safety. That was despite periodic expressions of concern by the London Fire Brigade about compliance with the fire safety order, all of which should have been drawn to their attention. The TMO's failure to attach sufficient importance to fire safety is illustrated by its reliance on a single person, Carl Stokes, as fire risk assessor for its entire estate, despite his lack of qualifications and experience, by its failure to carry out necessary remedial work identified in fire risk assessments promptly, by its failure to provide measures to mitigate the absence of an effective smoke ventilation system, and by its failure to introduce appropriate arrangements for inspecting and maintaining fire prevention systems, in particular self-closing devices on the entrance doors to individual flats. In addition, the TMO failed to maintain a reasonably accurate record of those residents of the tower who were vulnerable for one reason or another and likely to need help to escape if a fire occurred.
Again, deregulation. Having someone that's not qualified to do a job, doing a job. Why on earth would you allow that? And once again, we've got a situation where these people seem to not give a crap about the vulnerable and the disabled.
Part 6 of the report contains our findings about the refurbishment itself. And again, the picture is disturbing. First, the regulatory context in which the work was carried out was, in our view, unsatisfactory because the statutory guidance, which was treated by many in the construction industry, including those engaged on the refurbishment, as containing a sufficient statement of what was required, did not make it clear enough that it was subject to the overriding requirements of the building regulations.
Let's talk red tape and deregulation. This is a Conservative MP running for the leadership of the Tory party, and he is talking about more deregulation in housing.
Easing regulation and red tape, reducing the cost of products and services so that young people particularly have got a credible chance to get on the housing ladder, making sure we build, and we do need to build, and we do need to build up.
And this does tie into Brexit, because Brexit was about deregulation. Here's the former Bank of England talking about Singapore-on-Thames, and then you'll hear a clip from Jacob Rees-Mogg, arch-Brexiteer, talking about what Singapore-on-Thames is.
So while Brexiters promised that they were going to create Singapore on the Thames,
but we've had a couple of years that made people think that we should have lots of regulation, and it's been difficult for those of us who believe in free markets and free enterprise. But I'm going to disagree in a Christmassy sense, because I see we're all here obeying regulations, aren't we? I mean, this party is not going to be investigated by the police in a year's time. You are all very carefully socially distanced. We've moved, I'm pleased to tell you, from the metric back to the imperial system. I know you were at least 2 inches away from it, which is, as I understand it, what the regulations require during the social distancing period. But the great thing, the best thing about the state doing things, and doing them for an extended period, is you realise how much we need freedom and how much we need the free market and the private sector. Billions and billions have gone into the health service, but now we have to recognise that we need a growing economy to pay our way. And how are we going to get that? Higher taxes or lower taxes? You tell me. Can we have a shout out? Higher taxes or lower taxes? Okay. You see, I'm bound by collective responsibilities. I didn't want to express opinion. I just wanted to sample the opinion of the IEA. And do you think we'll get that by higher regulation or lower regulation? Lower. Very good. And I, again, am not expressing...
And then there's this. Paul Everall, the civil servant who was head of building control between 1991 and 2005, says, "You shouldn't just attack advisors on this. It really was the culture we were in with the government. For the past 10 to 15 years, we've had ministers who've been pressing for deregulation rather than regulation. We need a change in the culture in the government to see that regulation is not per se a bad thing."
In our report, we set out how the government's focus on deregulation dominated the department's thinking, such that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. The deregulation agenda had a parallel impact on social housing, on the social housing sector, particularly in terms of consumer standards and protection for tenants. The effects of that can be seen in the many failings of the TMO, which we set out in our report, and which were not prevented or addressed by the regulatory system then in place.
And I can give you more evidence, because a lot of the problems that we're facing now are down to deregulation.
Rivers are filled with a chemical cocktail of sewage, agricultural waste and plastic, according to a cross-party group of MPs, and it's putting both public health and nature at risk. A new report released today finds that not a single river in England is free from pollution. The Environmental Audit Committee wants to see tougher monitoring and enforcement.
Britain's big banks under sustained attack on the markets. As we go on air, there are crisis talks about how to stabilise the banking system.
Just had Freedom Day on August the 1st. Freedom to convert even more commercial buildings to residential use under permitted development and lighter touch planning system.
And that housing stock that was converted from commercial to residential was poor quality housing because there was a lack of regulation.
The Department of Health's annual report that was published yesterday. I suppose there was other stuff going on, which is why it wasn't picked up, but I did find it this morning, and I'm going to talk you through these literally jaw-dropping, some would say scandalous numbers. £8.7 billion lost in total on £12.1 billion of PPE purchased in a single year, 2020 to 21. Of that, £670 million, I'll say that again, £670 million of PPE is being written off because it can't be used because, for instance, according to the Department of Health, it's defective. £2.6 billion of PPE not suitable for use within the health and social care sector, which the department considers might be suitable for other uses, although these potential other uses are as yet, in the words of the Department of Health, uncertain. £750 million of PPE in excess of the amount that will ultimately be needed, and £4.7 billion of adjustment to the price because they paid over the odds to the tune of £4.7 billion.
The tenant management organisation, as the client, manipulated the process of appointing an architect to design the refurbishment in order to avoid the need to invite open tenders for the architectural services. It did so because it wanted to appoint Studio E, the architect for the existing Academy and Leisure Centre project, despite the fact that it had no experience of overcladding a high-rise building. That turned out to have significant consequences, because Studio E failed to recognise, as a reasonably competent architect should have done, that the insulation and rain screen chosen for the refurbishment were combustible and unsuitable for that purpose. ACM panels were chosen as the rain screen to keep down the cost. Neither Ryden, the principal contractor, nor Harley, its cladding subcontractor, was aware of the properties of the materials specified for use in the refurbishment, although Harley, as a specialist subcontractor dealing with cladding, should have been, and Ryden, as principal contractor, had its own responsibility to ensure the materials were suitable. One of the problems that afflicted the refurbishment was a failure on the part of all concerned to understand where responsibility for any particular decision lay. That was especially the case in relation to the choice of the rain screen. The generally prevailing view was that since aluminium composite material panels had been used on other buildings without apparent problems, they were suitable for use on the tower. But no one was prepared to accept responsibility for having chosen them, and when questioned, everyone who was asked said that someone else had been responsible for ensuring that they were suitable. We find that Studio E, Ryden and Harley all took an unacceptably casual approach to contractual relations. None of their employees engaged on the project understood the relevant provisions of the building regulations, the statutory guidance, or such guidance from industry sources as was then available.
More deregulation.
That might not have mattered quite so much if proper advice had been taken from a competent and experienced fire engineer, or if building control had performed its task properly. In fact, the tenant management organisation did instruct Exover Warrington Fire to produce a fire safety strategy for the refurbishment, which should have included advice on the effect of the overcladding and the compliance of the external walls with the functional requirements of the building regulations. Exover produced 3 versions of a fire safety strategy, but each version was stated to be a draft and was incomplete because it did not deal with that particular question, which it said would be covered in a future issue of the report. It was clear, therefore, that the fire safety strategy was incomplete, but no one asked Exover to finish its work, nor did anyone provide it with details of the proposed cladding to enable it to do so. Exover itself failed to ask for the missing information or to complete the work it had been instructed to carry out. The failure to obtain a final report was probably critical, because if Exover had considered the proposed cladding, it should, and probably would, have identified the fact that the insulation and the rain screen did not comply with the statutory guidance or, more importantly, the building regulations.
Easing regulation.
In Part 8, we set out our findings on the management and training of the London Fire Brigade in the years leading up to the fire. That part of our investigations represented a continuation of the work started in Phase 1, in which I described the response of the LFB on the night. I was critical of certain aspects of that response, in particular the way in which the control room handled calls from people trapped in the building, and the actions of some of the incident commanders who had not been properly trained to deal with a fire of that nature.
Now, as much as the fire service should be held to account for a lack of training, this goit was responsible for defunding the fire service for over 2 terms. I wonder if anyone's going to bring that up. We can also put a bit of blame towards Sadiq Khan, because he's now in his 3rd term as well. And it makes me wonder how much he's actually tried to fix the fire service. Let's finish off with the recommendations.
Although some steps have already been taken to respond to the many failures that we have identified, we think that more can and should be done to bring about a fundamental change in the attitudes and practices of the construction industry. Only such a change can ensure that in future buildings in general, and higher risk buildings in particular, are safe for those who live and work in them. We think that in different ways, implementation of our recommendations will improve fire safety, particularly in high-rise buildings, and ensure that dangerous materials cannot be used in construction in the future. They will also improve the efficiency of fire and rescue services nationally. Our recommendations include, but are not limited to, the following: the appointment of a construction regulator to oversee all aspects of the construction industry, bringing responsibility for all aspects of fire safety under one government department, the establishment of a body of professional fire engineers properly regulated and with protected status, and the introduction of mandatory fire safety strategies for higher risk buildings, a licensing scheme for contractors wishing to undertake the construction or refurbishment of higher risk buildings, the regulation and mandatory accreditation of fire risk assessors, the establishment of a College of Fire and Rescue to provide practical, educational and managerial training to fire and rescue services.
How have we got to a position where there seems to be, according to the Enquiry, a lack of training for managerial positions in the fire service? This is just beyond shocking. Corruption and deregulation are at the core of this, and I think the one big takeaway we can have is when you hear a Conservative MP or a Reform MP saying deregulation, think danger. Because after this and all the other scandals I've shown you, whenever they're saying that, what it really means is danger. Now, this has been edited, and I'm now going to show you a clip from a Tory MP this morning before the report came out. Have a listen to this.
Do you have any regret of previous Conservative government's policies of deregulation, and whether that may have led to this building being less safe than it should have been?
I don't accept that. And what I would point to is the action that we took since the tragedy to do two things. One, to identify those buildings most at risk and to provide the funding to ensure that things like dangerous cladding can be removed with the 4.5 billion Building Safety Fund.
That's all good and well, except we now know that there are people still with cladding on because they can't get it off because that fund didn't cover it. But it's no good to those that are already dead.
And secondly, to strengthen the regulation through several acts of Parliament, namely the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Act, to ensure that we act on the recommendations of the inquiry in phase 1 of the inquiry, but also to make sure that it doesn't happen again, as I said.
You say you don't accept that, but there will, in all likelihood, be criticism today of ministers, probably from your era of Conservative government. Will you accept that criticism?
We'll look very carefully at what the report says and where mistakes were made. Of course, we will look at that and make a judgment as to what the inquiry has found. Of course we will. I think the most important thing for the survivors and those who passed away and the families of those people is that we all work together to make sure that this never happens again.
Definitely a long one today, folks, and my word, my heart goes out to those victims of Grenfell and the families affected. Wow. This is just typical of the UK, and I hope we begin to change this, and I'll do a bigger video tomorrow. Once again, thanks for your support, thanks to my members, thanks to my Patreons. Please support this channel, it would be really appreciated, and I will continue to do more videos just like this. Thanks for listening, bye for now.